When you recycle just one aluminum can, the energy saved can power a TV for up to 3 hours or keep a 100-watt bulb burning for close to 4. At Coca-Cola, we are committed to continuously enhancing the sustainability of our packaging and our business, and aluminum cans offer us many opportunities to do just that. Sustainable packaging starts with design. Over the years, we've reduced the weight of an aluminum can by 33%. By creating lighter cans, we use fewer resources and less fuel to bring our beverages to you. But what happens after you drink that refreshing can of Coke, Diet Coke, or Coke Zero? It's time to recycle. More than 123,000 aluminum cans are recycled every minute of every day, and aluminum is endlessly recyclable. How does an aluminum can become a new can again? The answer? Efficiently. As part of the recycling process, recovered cans are shredded and melted. The melted aluminum is then hardened into ingots, and the ingots are made into aluminum sheets. The aluminum sheets are used to make new cans, and the cycle begins again. It's that simple. In fact, more than 95% of recycled aluminum cans are made into new beverage cans. And recycling aluminum is so efficient that used beverage cans can be recycled in as little as 60 days. And when aluminum is recycled, the energy savings are significant. This year alone, the energy savings from aluminum can recycling represents 11.5 billion kilowatt hours, enough energy to light a city like Pittsburgh for 6 years. But almost half of aluminum cans that are produced are not recycled. Instead, too many used cans are thrown out. That's where we come in. Coca-Cola Recycling was established to help close the loop, to help Coca-Cola reach our long-term goal to recover and reuse 100% of the bottles and cans we use. We know that the recycling loop begins with consumers, because it doesn't matter how recyclable aluminum cans are if consumers throw them in the trash instead of the recycle bin. Coca-Cola Recycling is making the case for recycling, to let everyone know why and how it's done. We take our message to NASCAR races, sporting events, state fairs, and other big events around the U.S. And while we're there, we're helping recycle our used bottles and cans. And we're working closely with incentive-based programs like Recycle Bank and Pay As You Throw to encourage consumers to recycle more and waste less. We're also working with recycling companies to make certain that there is a market for recycled materials and the infrastructure to make recycling work. And while we're at it, we're doing our part, piloting initiatives designed to turn us into a zero-waste system. Coca-Cola is committed to sustainability in all areas of our business. So, whether your used can turns into the spiral binder on your notebook, the parts on your new car, or a new can that holds your favorite Coca-Cola beverage, Coca-Cola Recycling aims to close the loop and ensure that every aluminum can is reborn.
And now, please welcome Jim Marvel, Vice President of Great Plains Coca-Cola Bottling Company.
Hey, welcome to the Surviving the Elements speaker series. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone today. I'm going to put my bottle of water down here so it's close by. Pardon the commercial opening for this session, but I love that video. I had a small part in helping to establish Coca-Cola Recycling. It's something that I'm truly passionate about. So I'm very happy to be here with everyone today. And that kind of fun and interesting video is a part of our focus on sustainable packaging. It's part of an overall umbrella program that we have at Coca-Cola that we call Live Positively. And it's focused on a few key areas, including healthy lifestyles, energy and climate, sustainable packaging, and of course, water stewardship. In the area of water stewardship specifically, we've saved over 6 billion gallons of water since 2005 through water efficiency savings in our facilities, such as installation of what we call air rinsers, cleaning out cans, water reclamation systems, and the addition of dry lubricant on our conveyor lines. This is equivalent to 9,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And through our rain barrel donation programs, we've donated more than 40,000 ingredient drums for reuse as rain barrels since 2008. And I hope you got a chance to see the display in the back of the room. We're literally going to be taking drawings to win 8 of those rain barrels, and we'll figure out how we can get them home to everybody who wins. But by collecting rainwater that normally flows off a property, rain barrels save money on water bills, conserve water during dry periods, and prevent polluted runoff into local watersheds. I have to say I'm truly honored to be here with you today to represent the Coca-Cola Foundation and the 1,500 employees of Great Plains Coca-Cola that are based right here in Oklahoma. We're thrilled to work with our partners at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum to sponsor this speaker series that is in honor of the Brown family's commitment to the community as a local Coca-Cola bottler. They owned the Coca-Cola bottling company since it started here in 1922 until it was sold to our corporation in 2011. And we'll actually have some members of the Brown family here with us later today. Through our Live Positively platform, we learned that a commitment to sustainability had to come from a change in our culture. It must be embedded in everything that we do. And over the next 4 weeks, this speaker series will help to explore the importance of sustainability for all of us, starting today with a bit of a history lesson on what happens when we don't make sustainability a priority, to learning how we can all make sustainability a part of our daily lives. This series will give us all a chance to truly make a difference. I want to mention a few fun and interesting components of our sustainability focus that you guys are going to have a chance to experience today. So, in the category of Did You Know, this is a bottle of Dasani water. Something really unique about it is that up to 30% of this bottle is made from plant material, literally from plants, and it still is 100% recyclable. Everybody's going to have a chance to try that today. We've got a Dasani drop bar set up over here where you can grab a bottle of Dasani water and flavor it with a drop, which is kind of the latest happening in the beverage business. So I hope you get a chance to try that. I already touched on the rain barrels, so please, if you haven't signed up for one, put your name in the drawing, and at the end of the day, we're going to pick 8 people to be able to have their very own rain barrel. After each one of our presentations, there's going to be time for Q&A. There should be index cards on all of your tables, and afterwards, if you have any questions, please write that down on the card and someone will come around and collect it from you. Our first talk today, Should Ranchers Study History, will be given by Jay O'Brien, whose family has been in the ranching business in the Texas Panhandle for generations. Good stewardship has always been a key tenet with the ranches O'Brien has been involved in. In fact, he won the Society of Range Management's Excellence in Grazing Management Award in 1995 with a presentation emphasizing the turf and riparian areas. And I looked that up and I know what that means now. O'Brien has served on numerous boards, including the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Texas Cattle Feeders Association, Cattlemen's Beef Board, and the Texas Beef Council. He is the 2007 recipient of the National Gold Spur Award, a joint recognition by some of the industry's leading organizations for lifetime achievements of the nation's top ranchers. This unique award, the only national distinction of its kind, recognizes outstanding contributions to the ranching and livestock industry. More than bringing prestige to an individual, the award spotlights the humanistic and scientific contributions of the livestock and ranching industries. Please join me in welcoming Jay to this stage.
Thank you. You missed one key thing. I'm a lifetime addict of Coca-Cola. Except for a short period where they tried to screw up the recipe. But I'm back. Well, it's really incredible to start out this program. I mean, you have 4 programs that are impressive as can be, and I'm sorry I live so far away that I can't be here for all of them. I looked at these programs, and at first I thought, I'm on the wrong program. the history program, and then I looked in the mirror and I thought, well, maybe you're the right guy. But I looked on through, and I'm pretty outclassed. I mean, boy, the worst hard time may be one of the most terrifying and interesting books that's come out in the last 2 decades. I recommend it to everybody if you haven't read it. But for me to be up here with Timothy Egan, that's incredible. Or the Merrick Chair of Western American History. Gee whiz, I took one Western history course in my whole life. But I do have a little experience I can talk from, and some of that experience is mine, and some of it's even the experience of my father's. In fact, when The Worst Hard Time came out, I read it and I liked it so much, I took it over to my father, who was 92 years old. And I gave it to him, and I said, you ought to read this, you'll like it. And he'd been in the Panhandle his entire life. He was born in Hereford in 1917. And Daddy, I came back the next day, and he'd read about 2/3 that book. And so I knew he liked it, and I said, pretty good, isn't it? And he said, yeah, Jay, it really is. And he proceeded, I bet we talked for 2 hours with him telling me stories about the Dust Bowl. And it was really just fantastic experience. And so I left, and I came back the next day, and the book was finished. And I said, sir, sorry to see it in, weren't you? And he said, you know, Jay, he said, you could tell that he wasn't there during the Dust Bowl. And I said, yeah. I said, but Daddy, I said, if he'd been there during the Dust Bowl, he'd be as old as you are. And he thought about it, and he said, yeah, and proceeded to tell me more stories about the Dust Bowl. So I've gained from history in a lot of different ways, and it's really lucky for me. I mean, it's really a blessing. But enough stories about my family. Speaking of books, one of the presenters you have is Alan Savory. And I bought this book back when it came out, and I was disappointed to see that I wasn't on the panel with him, because I would have loved to have talked to Alan Savory. And he's on the solutions panel. He ought to be on this panel, because his theories show what we can learn from history. Because for the past 40 or 50 years, he's broken more ranchers than anybody else I know. I mean, the damage to the land that's done by overgrazing, following Savory systems, is really incredible. You know, he leaves himself lots of outs if you read his book. And he always talks about the art. But originally, he predicted that you could increase your stocking rates 100, 200%. Today, he's still claiming 50%, and that's dangerous. His system, while much what he says is right on about how grazing can be positive for the environment, and is positive if done right for the environment, his system is a recipe for disaster. Okay, now you're probably getting the idea that I'm not shy about saying what I want to say. I remember Chuck Schrader, who I'm sure you all know. I was in a meeting with him and a lot of leaders of NCBA, and we were debating some subject, and Chuck looked over at the other people and he said, you know, I'm beginning to suspect that Jay never learned the words to Kumbaya. He was right. But when I saw that Savory was on the program, I thought it was important to give the other side, because people unfortunately sign up for his idea because he's a good salesman. And they don't look at history, and they don't look at research. In 2008, the Society for Range Management, which is the organization of the scientists who really live research into grazing, put out a composite article that was edited and written by the editor-in-chief of their publication, a fellow named D.D. Brisky, and 8 other noted scientists from throughout the world. But they put out an article of peer-reviewed research of 47 experiments that ranged in duration from 2 years to 25 years in length, and they concluded that rotational grazing was not superior to continuous grazing when the metrics of interest were either plant health or livestock production. And I'd like to read you the conclusion of that paper. Rotational grazing as a means to increase vegetation and animal production has been subjected to as rigorous a testing regime as any hypothesis in the rangeland profession, and is found to convey few, if any, consistent benefits over continuous grazing. It is unlikely that researcher oversight or bias has contributed to this conclusion given the large number of grazing experiments, investigators, and geographic locations involved over a span of 6 decades. Okay, to state more clearly what that says, it says the promises of improved plant health and the ability to increase stocking rates is pure bunk. Okay, there was research released in 2000, 2002 that addressed some of the specifics extravagant claims. And I know that Savory will say that his system is not the same as short duration grazing, and he has expressed doubt that holistic resource management can be validated experimentally. You know, if science proves you wrong, what you say is it can't be proven by science or disproven by science because there's magic here. And that's really what he says. Now, you guys are going to get to hear him. And by the way, I'd be happy if you'll get hold of me and give me your email address. I will email you some of these papers so you'll be better prepared to see his. But let me address some of them. And I'm spending more time with this just because I've seen people go broke following Savory, and I'd hate to see more people do this. He claims that hoof action increases the water infiltration into the soil, and the research proves that this is false, and actually the infiltration is reduced when you have large numbers of cattle on a place. Their research shows that short duration increases erosion. At the same stocking rate, 17 of 19 experiments reported no differences for plant productions, that'd be plant health, plant types, between rotational and continuous grazing. At the same stocking rates, there's no effect on plant succession and range condition. At increased stocking rates, declining frequency and composition of mid-grasses happens with the short duration systems. Over a 13-year period, changes in bare ground and vegetation composition were primarily a function of stocking rate, not the grazing system. Short duration does not improve forage harvest efficiency. At similar stocking rates, 16 of 28 experiments reported no difference for animal production per head, and 10 showed greater per head production for continuous grazing. And when stocking rate was less than When stocking rate was less for continuous than rotation grazing, 9 of 10 experiments showed either similar or greater per head production for continuous grazing. Now, this is pretty big stuff. And those of us who take care of the land, who are stewards of the land, we pay attention to science. And we pay attention to what actually happens in the land. You know, those who know animals, who learn from how animals move, know that cattle are creatures of habit. They go about the same time to water. They graze with sort of the same group of cattle. And when you move them, it stirs them up, and it takes 2 or 3 days for them to get back into sort of a social pecking order and become comfortable. So it takes that period of time for cattle to once again start gaining. You know, when they did all those cattle drives, they didn't really gain weight until right at the end when they'd sort of slow them down on some of the good grass up north, and they'd let them regain some of that weight. Moving cattle is not good for production. So anyway, the response from believers in this cult to these reports was tremendous. And in the year 2009, there was a Rangeland magazine, which is a sort of a newsy magazine that the Society for Range Management put out, which published a lot of these responses, but they were all anecdotal. There was no science, and there was no objective assessment. And in fact, Brisky said, continued advocacy for rotation grazing as a superior strategy of grazing on rangelands is founded on the perception and anecdotal interpretations rather than an objective assessment of the vast experimental evidence. Okay, so what do you do if all the researchers tell you that what you're putting out is bunk? What you do is you change the name of what you're doing. And so all of a sudden, a lot of these believers started talking about mob grazing. And we started reading articles about mob grazing. Now, I'm not saying Savory uses the term mob grazing, but I'm saying that a lot of his followers do. And this article has a fellow named Bruce Anderson, who's University of Nebraska Extension Specialist, who signed on and actually put out a couple of early articles talking about how mob grazing was the way to do it. But this was sort of his report of experience, and he talked about, well, let me just read it to you. He said, with ultra-high stock density grazing on clay loam soils like I have, pasture quickly becomes a muddy mess. Mud gets on what was once a good grass, and animals refuse to eat it. After a couple of hours, the whole area looks like a mud hole. So even mob grazing didn't quite work, and extra dry or extra wet, high intensity, short duration has its problem. And I'm going to drop off that. I'll tell you, I'm not saying all rotational grazing is bad, because there's research that shows that the Merrill system, which is a 3-herd, 4-pasture system with longer intensity grazing, is actually healthy. Every cattleman I know rests some of their pastures when they need it. And it is an art. You have to watch the pastures because rain doesn't fall uniformly over an area. And all of a sudden you may find that a pasture that you rested fairly recently needs to be rested again because it hasn't had the rain it needs. Next week you're going to hear a scientist named Reese, and he's going to address the impact of drought. And I hope that you pay a lot of attention to him, because I suspect he'll talk about the timely need for destocking. And what we've learned in spades the last 3 years is you have to have a plan for drought. You know, we're looking at restocking right now because we had a pretty good fall on most of our ranches last year, but we're going to do it carefully, and we have a plan for rapid destocking if it turns out we're in a period like we were in the Dust Bowl. You know, Reese is going to talk, I'm sure, about the damage done by drought, and I want you to think about what if you're trapped with 150% of the carrying capacity of your land, and you've rotated through all those cells. And by the way, Savory, I may be assuming too much, he divides the land up into small traps that he calls cells, and he rotates cattle through them, sometimes in a cell for hours, sometimes for a couple of days. But it's a very labor-intensive and capital-intensive system. But what happens if you rotate through all those cells and you come back and you haven't had rain, and you're at the first cell? And what do you do with your cattle? And so systems are good, but you have to have flexibility. What we do is we stock about half of our country with what are called stockers, with yearlings, with light cattle that we're growing to be bigger. Sometimes we might buy cows as stockers, pregnant cows that we're planning to hold just 1 year, get a calf out of, and then they're usually older cows and then go on. There are lots of different ways to do it, but we try to utilize half of our country by cattle that we can remove fairly quickly. And we're convinced that nature doesn't follow models, that pure systems aren't good, that the natural state of nature is chaos. And I don't care whether you're talking about back when the Indians were here and the buffaloes went through and just devastated things and then they were gone, fire burned everything off, or whether you're talking about drought or floods. Averages are only averages of a widely disparate group of data. Now, this chart is the rainfall at Shamrock, Texas. Since I was coming to Oklahoma, I picked the closest place in Texas to Oklahoma. And it's fascinating. Here we have an average rainfall of 23.5 inches. The range is from 11 to 37. This is the last 26 years. Now, that's pretty incredible, 11 to 37 inches. And only 10 years were within 10% of average. Average is not normal. And if you look at history, it's never been normal. And we must recognize that drought is both unpredictable and a certainty. And how do you build a model out of that? If you're stocking with cows aimed at 100%, being stocked 100% of average, of what the land would carry at average rainfall, that'll work about 80% of the time. But the 20% of the time will kill you. And we really found this out the last 3 years. In 2010, we had a fantastic year. We grew lots of grass. We ended the year with a world of grass. The norm for somebody who has 100% stocking would be to keep the calves over for that extra grass and utilize that grass. And that worked. I mean, boy, the cattle did well through the winter of 2010, the early part of 2011. Then we had a hot, dry spring. And you wondered by June, you wondered where all your grass went. Now, that's unless you had a fire. If you had fire, there were fires with all that grass. If you had a fire, you didn't have any grass. And you really wondered where it went. And boy, the fires were widespread in 2011. The wind, with that heat and the drought, the wind blew like crazy. But anyway, let's say that you didn't lose your grass. And so you'd listened to Reese, and you destocked all those calves that you'd held through the year. And you sold them and you spread out your cows and you felt pretty good because you still had grass. Then we had some 115-degree days and no rain. And by June, you're running out of grass again. You wonder, where did this grass go? And so you got rid of 100 head. And early in the year, in March, there had been some sales, and cows brought $1,600 to $1,800 a head. And you're stocking, let's say you're stocking a 25,000-acre ranch, and so you've got 1,000 cows. So you take 10% of those cows and you sell them. And in June of 2011, they brought $800 a head. But you felt pretty good about it because you got rid of your older cows, you got rid of some of the poorer quality cows, and you really improved your herd. So you coasted on, but it stayed hot and it stayed dry. And by July, you had to reduce your herd another 100 head, and they brought a little less than $800 a head because everybody was destocking and cows went down like crazy. You couldn't rationalize this was good, but you bit the bullet and you did it because you needed to be able to save the herd you had left. So that was okay. So you made it through the winter the next year, and in 2012, things were a little better, but it was still hot. And when it rained, because of the amount of grass you'd eaten off, that rain ran off rather than soaked in. So the rain didn't do you as much good. And you really weren't feeling like you were in good shape. And the eat half, leave half, which is sort of a mantra among grazers, that you leave half the grass because you need that energy from that grass blades to go to the crown to keep the grass healthy to come back again the next spring. It's gone. You'd already eaten more than half. And you had these incredible cows that were hungry. And the grass termites had come in and they'd started eating on the crowns. Normally grass termites just eat the dead grass or weeds, but here you can see that they'd started eating on the crowns. And this picture was actually taken last fall after the country had recovered, because you can see the green, but in the back you can see there's some pretty healthy. But this is a place that the grass was eaten, the crowns were damaged enough that it didn't come back with the rain. And so you have these wide areas of no grass. And it'll have to come back from seed, and it'll take longer. And it'll be a serial succession of poor grasses to good grasses to get back. So you're in 2012, and you're not in very good shape, and you're worried about your cows because they're thin, and you're worried about whether they'll rebreed. And so you sell another 200 head. The price is a little better because everybody's sold off, and killer prices are better, but you're selling good, productive cows at $1,000 a head. So with your herd down to 600 head, you make it through another year, and in 2013, you finally get some relief, and you get some rain. It wasn't a good year, but you get better, and you want to restock. But all of a sudden, cows have gone back up to $1,600 a head, and you still have the damage from the grass termites. So you hold off restocking. So now here we are today, and you have great hopes for moisture. You have great hopes that we're going to be okay. Your 600 head are still in good shape, and you start thinking about restocking again. But cows are costing over $2,000, many of them $2,500, to replace those cows that you sold for $800 to $1,000. I mean, this is a wreck. This is a $500,000 wreck on a 25,000 acre ranch. It's a reason not to stock to 100% capacity. And that's a big lesson that those of us in the cattle business have learned. My father, when I was sitting and complaining in 2011 about how hot it was and dry it was, and I said, boy, I hope I don't see another year like this. He said, don't say that, Jay. And I said, why? And he said, you're saying you don't want to live very long. Well, he'd make it through the 30s. He'd made it through the 50s, the mild drought of the 70s. I mean, it was good for me for him to say that. And then he turned and he said, he said 32 was really, it just quit raining. But in 1940, we had a really good year. So, we will have a good year at the end of this period. We just want to survive. We just want to learn enough from history that we can survive and that the health of our ranches can survive. So what you do is you destock to be able to keep your ranch. But what you do with this great fluctuation that I showed you in rainfall is you stock very conservatively. Grass is a rancher's main asset, and we don't want to jeopardize it. So that's just very simple, and we want to leave some grass left. One range scientist spoke of the need of maintaining a quarter of the ranch's grazing capacity, even through the drought years. And I will tell you, that's easy to say. But you have 3 years like we had, or the 8 years like my father talked about, and you can't keep a quarter of it. I mean, you just have to just sort of get along the best you can. But the big thing is you stock conservatively enough that when you start getting recovery, the land can recover on its own, and you don't overstock during the recovery stage. That slide I showed you of the grass termites, that land's going to take some babying to come back. And there's no choice but to do it, or to have cows that won't rebreed, because the first thing that shuts down when an animal is short of feed is the reproductive system. And cows not rebreeding is the worst possible scenario, because you have all the expense and no revenue. Now, another thing history taught us is you can't supplement to get through a drought. In the 1970s, the government decided they'd help ranchers out, and they paid half of the feed bill because of what was really a fairly minor drought. And so people kept cattle on pasture in order to get that government dole, and the cattle kept eating the grass. And they kept eating down that they kept eating down the grass until it did damage to the crowns, and the government program actually did more damage to the land. And the government, it gave an inducement to people to be bad stewards of the land. And so I hope we've learned that that's a disaster too, that supplementing on grass is not healthy. So as I say, even with trying to be good stewards, you still make mistakes, and you still get things wrong, and drought hurts. But you just have to stay with the idea of not stocking too heavily. Brisky rightfully said, management, commitment, and ability are the most pivotal components of grazing system effectiveness. And grazing systems do not possess unique properties that enable them to compensate for ineffective management. And I know I'm hitting this pretty hard, but it's really important. And I see people who don't have a good concept of the damage that drought can do. And part of what you need to do when you have land is you need to establish your goals, and you need to stick with them. I've seen a lot of successful businessmen who've always dreamt of being ranchers. And so they buy land, and they buy it to get what a good friend of mine calls PRR, psychological rate of return. And it's real. I mean, I feel it. I know a lot of people feel it because land brings a lot more than it deserves to bring from a cash return on investment. But these businessmen, they buy this land, and they're so happy, and they're out there, and they're ranchers, and they're excited. But then, because they're businessmen, they start thinking about the internal rate of return. And they think, well, I've got this millions of dollars tied up in this piece of property, and it's not giving me very much return. And so they start trying to figure out how to get a higher internal rate of return. And so they buy into some bad systems, or they overstock it, and maybe they get some rainier years and they get along for a while, and then they get some of those drier years and the bottom falls out, and the businessmen they haven't had the experience where they can look at the land and they can recognize the damage they're doing as fast as they should, and all of a sudden it starts going down even faster. So while I believe strongly there's a need for having goals and recognizing what they are, there's a need for honesty in those goals too. And if psychological rate of return is part of your emphasis, don't forget it and hurt the asset. And I see people do that. So overgrazing is tough. Okay. So I've given you the lessons history has to teach about the land, or some of them. What about the market? Compared to grazing decisions and dealing with the weather, the market's a breeze. Now, I'm not saying it's easy to make money, and I'm darn sure not saying it's going to be easy to make money in the next few years, especially if you're just now entering the business and you're buying cattle after we've had a record upturn in prices. I'm just saying that the market's easier to deal with than the weather. The first lesson that history has to give you, and I think you can talk to almost any rancher and he'll tell you this, and that is that the market goes up because we deserve a higher market. It goes down because somebody's screwing us, whether it's Chicago or Packers, big feed yards, Washington, but it goes up because we deserve it. Now, we all know that, and that's really important, and we can see over an extended period of time, and this is a long graph, so it looks pretty good, that we have a nice upturn in fed steer prices. You can see, unfortunately, that here you've got some downturns as well. If you look back at the 73 wreck, it doesn't show to be a really bad wreck, but the market went from 54 cents to 32 cents. That was a monster break, and that broke a lot of cattlemen. And so this may not look like the downturns are tremendous, but anytime you lose 40, 50% of the value of your animal, it's a big market. So we can look at who causes those breaks, who the bad guy is, because we know we deserve more money, or we can just accept that the market's going to fluctuate. And we can realize that it's part of it, just like the drought, having lots of volatility in it. And if it's going to fluctuate, we need to figure out how to live with a fluctuating market. And a long time ago, when I was first starting out, I did a lot of studying of different ag econ people and their how to deal with market risk and how to protect yourself against this volatility. Wayne Purcell was at OSU and did some of the best work around. But what I found was that they all gave the predictability of their system. And strangely enough, in almost all systems, they had an 85% chance that their system was right within 7.5% of the final price. Well, that sounded pretty good till I realized that meant there was a 15% fluctuation in that range, and that I could fall in that and still go broke. That didn't sound good. So what I figured out is it wasn't the system that was important. It was that 85% and 15%. And what that told me is if the market moved either direction, 15%, it was probably a good idea to fade it because the market was going to fluctuate. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't in defined time periods, but you knew you could coast along with no protection until you got a good move up, and then you probably needed to buy some market protection. If it moved 20%, there was a 95% chance that fading it was right. Now, you don't have to have some magic system. You don't have to know Fibonacci numbers. You don't have to know oversold or overbought. If you could just go by this, you just have to be satisfied with taking a risk when the market's collapsed or hedging a profit if the market goes up. You have to be satisfied that you always won't get the top, but you won't go broke. So this all sounded good, except I had to remember my brother taught me years ago a cardinal rule of commodity trading, and that's if it's obvious, it's wrong. So you don't bet your whole farm every time because that 15% will kill you. But you have to have some sort of protection. Now, when you look at yearlings, it's 750-pound cattle, and this is a year by year, it has a little different story. It's still basically the same, but yearling prices are impacted by a lot of things external to supply and demand. And so you have drought affecting it, you have corn prices, in the 70s you had interest rates. There are a lot of cost items that impact yearlings, and so you get a bigger swing in some way. But if you look at this chart, which is fascinating to me, you have to wonder what's going on. And you see some seasonality to it, but you also see the same sort of ups and downs that are pretty tremendous. And if I ask you guys who keep up with the cattle market, if I ask you when the biggest move up was the cattle market, if you're a bunch of cattlemen, you'd probably tell me in the last year. But actually, it was in the period from 2009 to 2012. And if you look at the chart there on the left, you see that we went 27 months without a decrease of 5%. Now, in anybody's book, that's a bull cattle market. And I'm calling if it's less than a 5% break, it doesn't break a trend line. So how do you deal with a period like that, 2009 to 2012, from going from 90 cents a pound to $1.50 a pound? How do you deal with that if you're producing yearlings? And how do you protect your price and still benefit from the up? Well, I'll tell you guys, I'm on the history panel, and I'm a better predictor of the past than I am the future. So I really can't answer that question. But I can tell you that this will happen because we've seen it happen. But I'll also tell you that you can get protection by buying puts, which give you possibility of going higher, but charge you a margin for getting in. For example, in what's called an on-the-money put, if cattle are trading at $1.65 and you buy the right to hedge at $1.65, it's going to cost you someplace between $3 and $5 a hundred. But then you get all the way up. If it goes on to 180, you get the whole ride up. And if you follow this percentage move theory, then you would have already had room, already had margin to where you could afford, after a 15, 20% move up, to buy the put. And so you can buy protection. Now, I have a friend who uses a trailing stop. And I'll give you an idea of what a trailing stop is. I don't know how much future knowledge you'll have. But he looks at the futures, and let's say we're trading at that 165 area. He'll put a stop in, which means if the market hits that, it'll take him short, and it'll hedge him. But he puts in $3 below, and then every time the market moves up, he moves up with it. Now, this friend of mine uses a CIC order, and that's cancel if close. And that means if the market goes back down before it can get to him, he calls his broker. He says, no, I don't want to sell. This market's going higher. So he doesn't really, you can't use a CIC order if you use these plans. But you can use some market protection and enjoy these bull markets like we've had in really the last 5 years, ever since 2008. The other thing I think this graph will show you is there's seasonality to the market. And if we had a calf graph up here, it'd show you that calves are highest in the spring, because right now people are stocking their grass and they're buying calves, and they've got green grass coming and they just have to have something. And so they're buying them. So you've got a high in your input cost in the spring. And in most years, you'll notice in the fall, in the end of the year, you've got a low. That's when you have to sell these cattle. So you probably want to be a little counter-seasonal some way or another. Or you can always do it with futures and hedging or pre-marketing, but it's probably not too good to ignore the historical seasonality of markets. Okay, so I've told you that we're not guaranteed rain, we're not guaranteed grass, we're not guaranteed high prices. What do we do then, if that's true, about buying cows? Now, people historically buy cows looking at what a calf will bring, which today is about $1,000, figuring they'll get 8 of them out of them, see what the cost will be of carrying that cow, and figure out what they can buy them. At that figuring, it'd be great to go out and buy a $2,500 cow now. I mean, you'd make a lot of money. The only problem is, if you look at history, those premises aren't right. None of us produce 8 cows out of a cow. We have some of them that when they're 3, 4 years old show up dry. And that means that we're not going to average 8 or 9 cows. And none of us get 100% calf crop except at the coffee shop. So you have to look at your real expenses, and also that $1,000 isn't going to last forever. History tells us that the best cure for high prices is high prices. We're increasing the cow herd as fast as the grass will let us. And if we have rains this year, we'll have $3,000 cows because people are going to want to own cows. And then we may have 4,000. Who knows what we'll have as a high on cows? But I know that the people that buy at the high are going to be hurt. So what do you do? Learn from history. You get back in the business, but you do it conservatively. You don't let the emotions of high prices rule you. And you look at what actually happens. So here we are, and how do we learn these things? And the best thing is go talk to your neighbors. I don't know a rancher that won't share his wrecks with you. And I may be dwelling a little bit extra on wrecks, but the good times take care of themselves. But to go and learn from people that have been in the business and what wrecks you can get into is healthy. And your own neighbors have the most germane information for you. Then also you study your own history. You keep good records. You do, on the grass, you do transects, lines that you measure the amount of grass year after year to see what the difference of production is. You do enclosures so you can tell where cattle don't graze at all, how much you produce and how much you should be grazing. You look at the encroachment of brush through the use of these enclosures. You look at good financial records. We charge every expense against cattle. We want to go back to the least common denominator, which is the cost of producing a pound of beef. And we want to see what it cost us. That means our office overhead, my gasoline, the cost of delivering the protein to the cattle, all of that has to go back into the figure. Now, I'm not saying if you have the ranch for recreation and you've got somebody keeping your house up, that you have to charge that to the ranch, to the cattle. But I'm saying you've got to keep good records, and it's really, really important, and you don't let the fact you're on the cash basis of accounting keep you from keeping profit center books. So we've got history telling us we are entitled to profits, or 100% calf crops, good market, average rainfall. We have to look at what we are entitled to. And what are we entitled to? Property rights. We all know we're entitled to property rights, right? I think history would tell us we're not. History would tell us that we have those property rights that we take as inalienable. We have those property rights only by the will of the masses. The Indians would tell you that. The British that were here before 1876 would tell you that. The czars would tell you that. Marie Antoinette would tell you that. Property rights are not ours unless we convince the masses it's good for them. And that's pretty scary. Whoever put together this program was very aware of it. You have lots of speakers on water rights. And boy, that's key. And this is really right, because we've always known that we've owned the water. It came with the land. But there are limitations on the use of the water and the land. So I want to end with a little history lesson, even though I'm not a historian. And when I grew up, movies and television all were brilliant. They recognized that the American cowboy was a hero. Westerns were the American morality play. You know, you think about it, they're where we got our standards of morality. And every child grew up wanting to be Matt Dillon, Davy Crockett, Rowdy Yates. I mean, that was their life, you know. And that was a wonderful thing. And I'll tell you what, if you trespass on the Cartwright's land, you trespassed on my land. And that was the feeling of everybody. And during the Industrial Revolution, families moved to the cities en masse. But everybody had a grandmother, an aunt, an uncle back on the farm. And they went to visit them, and one of their fondest memories was gathering the eggs, milking the cow, going to the farm. And that was important. There's one of the most famous plays in our whole culture is Death of a Salesman, and Willie Loman always wanted to go back to the soil. And it was key in the American mind. However, in the last few years, this feeling of connection to the farm, which served ranching so well for generation after generation, it's gone. You know, back then, eating a steak was American. Infringing on property rights was un-American. But we have generations now that have no connection to the farm. They're kids now that want to look at rocket men and not cowboys as their heroes. This museum used to represent what was part of all of our emotions. Now, for many generations, it's just history. Most kids in the city today have never visited a farm. If they know who Steve McQueen was, he was a cop who drove a car in San Francisco. If they know who the rifleman was, he was somebody who shot up a school in Colorado. They get their idea of branding from PETA and not from Rawhide or Red River. The Marlboro Man is not romantic, he's a killer. We can't capitalize on this image anymore. It's not out there. And laws can take away our rights and can do it based on incorrect perceptions about what we do and the value of our product. And this is a monster threat that history will show us, and not just Western history, history of mankind, is out there. We have a checkoff, which people pay on every animal that they sell, but it's grossly underfunded. And it doesn't enable us to address politics. So we better be active in politics, in our cattle associations, both state and national. We better work because we have a great story to tell about our stewardship of the land and about our animals. And we have a great, healthy product to deliver. But we're not entitled to the right to own and sell our cattle. We'll have to work to retain our rights. So I've sort of been, I worry, a little bit on the negative, and I really don't mean to be. We ranchers were truthfully blessed. We get to be out of doors, and the few that know what we do envy us. People pay a lot of money to pretend that they're doing what we do on a daily basis. Our kids grow up and they get to know the elements, they get to understand the vagaries of nature, and with proper management and care, we take care of a great renewable resource of grass, and we convert it to the highest quality protein available. In addition to tasting fantastic, beef offers iron, zinc, amino acids, and protein in an easily assimilable form. Our lives have purpose for society, and our history is joy. It's a wonderful way to serve the Lord. So I'll take any questions you have. Won't necessarily answer them, but I'll sure take them. surely there's somebody that believes in savory that can hammer me. Have at it. You know, it's a little termite that eats mature grass. And if you go back to, let me see if I can do that. If you go back to this picture, you can see, you can see tunnels they sort of look like little mounds of dirt, and they go in those from one plant to the other one. And they're always there. And really, I think probably in normal years, they do us good because they clean up a lot of the decaying weeds and everything, and they turn it into humus. So they probably do us good. But in dry years, when the whole plant turns dormant during the summer because of the heat and the drought, they come in and they just absolutely remove it, and it means that grass is not there to slow down the rain and allow it to soak in, and the grass is not there to rejuvenate those crowns so that they can regrow and you actually have crowns die. And it's pretty scary in a drought. I never had seen it until this last 3 years.
Good morning. The program you mentioned in the 1970s where the government came in and helped feed the cattle, which resulted in so much damage to the grazing. I have two questions. One is, who was it that came up with that idea? Did ranchers go to the government, or was the government trying to help you, the ranchers? And secondly, did anyone have any idea that would be the result to the grazing issue?
Let me address the second question first. Range scientists knew it. And they responded, and they said, this is not a good idea. But we have seen historically that the government believes that when there's nothing to do something. And I don't know who came up with the idea. You know, it's funny, I can talk to you about the 30s and about who came up with the programs that we've lived under for the last, almost 80 years now on government price supports and things like that. Henry Wallace would be the answer there. I don't know who in the 70s came up with that program. It was not something that was lobbied for by cattle associations that I know. We certainly, cattlemen took advantage of it, but mainly it was sort of like the fuel shortage and the brilliant idea that if we're short of energy, let's take corn and make ethanol out of it and mandate that people have it in their gasoline. Now, it doesn't matter that it takes more energy to produce energy from ethanol than it gives us. At least they're doing something. So, I don't know who came up with it, but yes, people knew it was a bad idea. But we still lived with it for a couple of years. Any other questions? I don't know where I am time-wise. I think I'm okay. Well, I'll be around if oh, sure. In our country, reseeding is not really economically possible. And you get several different issues. And this is a relatively small area. And like I say, if you look up the top, there's good grass up there, and that grass has seed. And the best thing to do is let the cereal system work. And what happens in drouthy country like we have is you have a progression. And at first you'll get some 3-ons, which are pretty worthless, crummy grass, and then you'll get sand drop seed. And eventually you'll get back to the blue stems and the grama and the good grasses. But it's sort of a progression that just has to happen. And you could put in probably more than the land's worth in seed. I don't know if you'd get a good establishment of cover because we can't water it up, and we can't depend on rain when we seed, and it won't necessarily have the right cereal system. You know, we have years where we have a whole lot of weeds, and I have people that just get really upset. The system works, and what those weeds are doing is probably putting something in the soil it needs, because then you'll get a year where they die out, and you'll get the progression of grasses, and weeds always come first. And so rather than seeding in our area, we just sort of have to graze properly and give the grass a chance to revive on its own. Okay, I have one. Should I get to one more? Should I get to one more question?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
How long does this process take? The recycling, if you will?
I'm only 69, so I don't know. I saw the 50s when I was a kid. We had a ranch in New Mexico, and I tell you, I wasn't sure that it ever did rain. And there were expanses of country like this where the only thing green was the mesquite. And I went off to college and in '63, and I came back and went out to the ranch in '64, in the summer of '64, and it was incredible how the grandma grass had come back. And it was incredible. I'd never seen the ranch look that good. So how long it's going to take to revive will depend on how much rain we got. And I think those early 60 years in New Mexico were sort of like Daddy talking about 1940. I think it'll depend how much rain we get and whether we're stocking the country properly so that the grass has a chance to revive. I saw more recovery than I ever dreamt was possible in the fall of last year, of 2013. And if we have a wet spring this year, I believe it'll just keep going. And I think that we'll see gradually those areas turn to grass. And I think it could happen within 2 or 3 years if the land wasn't overgrazed going into it. And so it comes faster than we think it is. Nature, in its state of chaos, has learned that we're not important, we humans, and it can overcome us if we'll let it. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Jay. I learned one thing, and I'm going to learn something else. I learned that I probably shouldn't buy a ranch, and I'm going to learn how to tie a bow tie. You're gonna show me, right? What we're gonna do now is we're gonna go ahead and take a quick 10-minute break. There's drinks over here. Help yourself to those. Don't forget to put your name in the hat for the rain barrel, and the restrooms are out to the right. And if you'll join me back here in about 10 minutes, we'll have our next speaker. Thank you.